Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Why No One Plays. We're gonna be heading back into the bot lane to talk about another support champion today.
If it isn't the aspect everyone used to like.
Taric, the Shield of Valoran. Unpopular opinion, I actually think his old kit was better. If this is your first time watching Why No One Plays, I'd like to make a disclaimer that the series name is meant to be rhetorical. Obviously, there are people who play Taric, but he has a very low pick rate. My goal is to raise more awareness of the champion by analyzing why their gameplay or design doesn't appeal to the general player base, those who don't play him. So with that cleared out, let's get started. Back in the days before he was reworked, Taric was someone not many people really played, but everyone sort of respected due to what he could do in the hands of a capable player. In fact, he was one of the best counters for a lot of lane bullies in top lane, such as Renekton, Riven, Pantheon, and whatnot, because he could outsustain them while slowly whittling them down over time because they usually couldn't heal very fast early on while he could. Putting it in a simple way, he's sort of like the Paladin class in MMORPGs, where he was more than capable of dealing his fair share of damage, but was also armed with supportive capabilities more than the usual Berserker class, which in League's case would be juggernauts like Darius. For all intents and purposes, there wasn't anything particularly wrong with this design. He wasn't overpowered nor frustrating to play against, but he was a stat checker, which doesn't make for the most interesting gameplay since victory or defeat hinged on whether or not you had more or less stats against him, as all he really could do is walk up to you, stun you, and beat you to death. So Riot decided to rework him to fit the modern skill expression-centric League of Legends, doubling down on his utility to turn him into a Warden instead of a Bruiser. And initially, everyone's impression of him was actually favorable. His new kit had a lot more interactivity than just giving him and his allies stats, and that's all thanks to his new W, Bastion. They still kept the bonus armor he gives him and his team, only now instead of being a damaging ability, Taric links up with an ally and briefly shields them, so as long as they stay within a certain range of him, any ability he casts is also applied to them, meaning his Q, E, and ultimate act the same way Zed does with his shadows, only in this case, the shadow is his own teammate. A huge loss of damage, but in exchange, Taric now has the power to affect his allies from a far distance, meaning he can hook up with a diver or a tank to engage head-on into the enemy team and follow up with his abilities. His Q is still a heal, only now instead of behaving like the summoner spell heal, it's an AoE activation, with the healing getting stronger the longer you wait between each cast. It's nowhere near as strong as his old heal, but it had much longer range and it could heal more than just him and someone else. His E also received a change, dealing less overall damage and not being able to point and click anymore, but now it scales with his armor and is also an AoE stun in a line in front of him. As you can no doubt surmise from his basic abilities, Taric lost a lot of individual power in exchange for much more area coverage, so he can heal his whole team or stun more than one target. But the main catch to his rework was his completely changed ultimate. Now, instead of giving himself and his team bonus attack damage and ability power, Taric straight up turns everyone invincible for 2.5 seconds after a delay lasting the same duration. Cosmic Radiance can be a total game changer when used correctly because Kaele's ultimate is known for its massive potential and she can only target one person. Now imagine if your whole team got it. So much damage was stripped from his kit in favor of more utility, and for a while people assumed the stance that it was a good trade-off given just how impactful Taric can be in a fight. He had heals, stuns, shields, stat boosts, and arguably one of the best ultimates in the game. What's not to love about him? For a time, people did love him. I mean, they loved playing him, not him as... Alright, let's move on. His newfound potential in the bot lane made him a frequent presence in both solo queue and pro play during the better part of Season 7 and 8. But then they started to realize there's a lot of issues with Taric's kit that just does not feel very good. Having literal AoE team invulnerability means Taric can single-handedly win 5v5 collisions, especially if he times it right to shield his team from thousands of damage. But with so much potential impact, it needs to be compensated in other ways. Taric's most prominent issue is that Cosmic Radiance is too good of an ability, so to balance him out, his Q, W, and E have been made much weaker than you would expect. Bastion's shield lacks any base amount, Dazzle has short range, a long cast time, and the stun doesn't last very long, and Starlight's touch heals extremely little unless you get max charges. Even then, it's barely as good as some other supports with heals, making him worse than most champions in every way outside of his ult. There are a ton of champions in the game with underwhelming basic abilities in exchange for an amazing ultimate, such as Kennen, Amumu, and Malzahar to name a few, but at least with their ultimates you'll know that you can still be of worth to your team. Taric unfortunately doesn't even get that concession. Cosmic Radiance can very well solo carry team fights on its own, but it can also be a completely useless ability. It takes 2.5 seconds to arm and lasts for 2.5 seconds, but during that period of time, your team can be completely devastated and forced to retreat, which wastes the invincibility. On the other hand, let's say your team is in a decent position to attack. If the enemy team has champions with disengage or escape tools, they can simply stall out your ultimate before going back in. And let's say neither of those situations occur. Let's say your team is in a good spot to attack and the enemy team is completely vulnerable. You still can miss your ultimate if everyone spreads out from you and your tethered ally, and with the mentality solo queue fosters in players of every man for themselves, it's almost impossible to consistently get good uses of your ultimate because there's so many things that can go wrong. Missed timings, bad team composition, bad situation, enemy team can stall or peel, your team gets bursted, etc. The reason people don't fear Taric's invincibility nearly as much as Pantheon's, Kael's, or I guess Tryndamere's to some extent, is because it doesn't happen instantly. 2.5 seconds is a long time. That's almost as long as being rooted by a Morgana Q. If you're a squishy AD carry and there's a Zed on the enemy team, he'll probably tear you a new one long before that ultimate finishes activating. Although I am aware of a way to circumvent that. It's sort of technically a cheese strategy, so I wouldn't recommend it, but I've seen a few Kindred and Taric duos where Kindred pops their ultimate and then Taric would time Cosmic Radiance to activate right as the ult wears off. Outside of that though, it's just an inconsistent ability. While his basic abilities don't have the same kind of numbers as other supports, they make up for it by being spammable thanks to Taric's bravado, which upon using an ability, his next two basic attacks reduce his Q, W, and E cooldown by 1 second each. Because Taric gets one charge of Starlight's Touch with each bravado attack, you can Q, then auto attack twice, and you'll essentially have another cast of your Q available immediately. And if you're constantly attacking, Dazzle's cooldown will drop quickly, so you'll be able to stun very often. But therein lies Taric's second biggest issue. Even though his Q has effectively no cooldown, it's not something you can just cast for free. Taric has some of the worst mana issues in the entire game, far more than most champions you would expect to struggle with mana early on, like Ryze, Cassiopeia, and Anivia. But he doesn't have equal access to gold the way they do because he's a support, so he can't CS minions, or at least he shouldn't. Since he's a melee tank, he doesn't have the luxury of building utility mana items the way ranged enchanters can. In other words, you have to choose between either mana or durability and not both. On a champion who's not only an easy target for ranged champions, but with extreme mana costs. There's also very few support items in the game that provide both mana and durability, and this was exacerbated even further during Season 11 when Riot took out a lot of mana items like Iceborne Gauntlet and Righteous Glory, both of which were pretty good on him. If it's any comfort, Tear of the Goddess has become much cheaper, but in exchange, instead of capping at 1000 bonus mana, it gives you only 600. That's a trade-off Taric would be willing to accept, but practically speaking, it's not a good idea to rush Tear early on with him unless you're up against low damage enemy lanes like Kalista and Braum. Taric's worst counters are ranged champions, which not only is the AD carry like 100% of the time, but mages and enchanters take up half of the cast in the bot lane. Since he has no mobility or engage, he's very easy to harass in lane, which requires him to build defensive items, meaning he can't exactly pick up a tier. And this does not alleviate in the mid-game either, because that's when assassins and skirmishers are at their strongest, which means you still can't buy mana items because you have to pick up your core builds, such as Locket, Zeke's, and Knight's Vow to protect your carries. Frozen Heart can be purchased to subsidize your mana issues, but to my knowledge you shouldn't get that until your 4th or 5th item, and by then, the outcome will likely have already been decided. Needless to say, Season 11 has made it a lot harder for Mr. Fabulous to deal with his already horrendous resource intense early to mid-game. Combined with the subpar healing, lackluster damage, and crowd control, a lot of players can get easily frustrated by how smothered they feel by Taric's restrictive limitations alone. His poor laning and natural weakness to ranged champions leads many players to try to find success with him in other roles, such as the jungle, or, as many of you have no doubt experienced at least once or twice in rank, Gold Funnel. Because of how insane Taric's utility is for his allies, he greatly depends on hypercarries to weaponize those tools. After all, he can equip anyone with an AoE stun and 2.5 seconds of invulnerability. These issues make a recipe for disaster, as the only way Taric can comfortably get through the early and mid game is by not laning at all. By teaming up with power farming junglers like Master Yi, he can wander around the rift without having to watch his mana cost because he won't be in lane to take damage from enemy champions. His lack of engage is completely fixed since Master Yi can alpha strike to close the distance on targets and then be stunned by Dazzle. Lastly, he can exclusively build support items and not defense items because the only time he has to be in combat is during skirmishes and teamfights, not in lane. That's the reason why nowadays most people only see Taric played for Gold Funnel, because unless you're extremely good at playing support, which most people aren't, Taric has such an unpleasant laning phase that it's probably more fun to play him like this than it is the conventional way. Outside of funnel, he's too team dependent. If you remember when I said in my Why No One Plays Braum video that Wardens cannot carry games the way Vanguards can, Taric faces this the worst out of any Warden in the game, worse than Braum and Tahm Kench. Since the impact of his abilities are largely dependent on how well his teammates know how to use them, not him, he can only be exclusively played as a duo queue champion or in pro play where everyone is communicating with each other. The three problems I've talked about so far coalesce to form problem 4. Taric faces a major identity crisis. As I mentioned before, even though he had a pretty one-dimensional kit and somewhat boring gameplay, old Taric had a very clear role. He buffed his teammates with lots of damage and heals while also dealing good damage on his own. In exchange, he was really susceptible to kiting because he had practically no mobility or range, making him an insane counter against melee team comps but an easy target against ranged team comps. When he was reworked, Riot wanted him to be some hybrid between an enchanter and a tank, but what really happened was that Taric became a full enchanter who just happened to be all melee. That made him super uncomfortable to play because he carried both the weaknesses of a tank and an enchanter at the same time, while only having the strengths of the latter. So essentially, by playing him, you took 1 step forward and 2 steps back. He has to build a mixture of support and tank items to circumvent this issue, but because he's a support, he doesn't have easy access to gold to build said items. His basic abilities have pretty abysmal scaling and low numbers, which makes him unviable in solo lanes compared to back in the day, where he was a pretty scary champion. Finally, his abilities can only function at full power by his teammates, which makes him inconsistent in solo queue, which is why he's been relegated to a gold funnel cheese pick because that's really the only role he can fill. See, normally when I make Why No One Plays videos, I try to look at both sides of a champion since everyone has their pros as much as they do cons. But I think with Taric, he's just bad. He feels really unsuitable for League of Legends. In fact, to me, it would make more sense for him to be in an MMORPG or something instead of a MOBA, and I'd wager a lot of players agree. Very little about him fits the ideals of a good champion in solo queue because his kit is so good, yet so bad at the same time it's frustrating to deal with, and so players just can't be bothered. That being said, when the stars align and everything works out perfectly in a game, Taric is the best support in League of Legends, period. I can't stress this enough. Cosmic Radiance is a busted ability, and when timed perfectly with all the right circumstances, you can potentially win the game off of a single press of a button. I think what Riot needs to do is either make him a dedicated enchanter and not this janky mixture of a tank with utility, or bring back his old identity of being a paladin type class who buffs his teammates and deals damage. In fact, I'm kinda surprised there isn't a paladin subclass in the game. There's only juggernauts and fighters, which would be the league equivalent of berserker and warrior. Anyways, I think that's it for today. I'd like to quickly give a shout out to the Taric main subreddit for giving much needed insight on the champion, and to all of the mains that are watching, what are your suggestions for what they can do to fix the champion, because I think he's in dire need of a fix, probably more than any other champion in the series so far. But if you enjoyed this video, a rating would be much appreciated, and if you'd like to see more content like this, consider subbing to the channel. Also check out the video description down below for links to my Discord and social media, as well as a playlist containing all my Why No One Plays videos if you'd like to watch more. But I'll wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.